Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever episode of Religion is Gray, the long awaited podcast that a lot of my friends and family have been awaiting, and probably no one on the YouTube channel has been awaiting. That all being said, I do want to quickly apologize for the delay in this video. Even the fact that this isn't going to be the original topic I intended on talking about, because, like I said before, my partner, the one I was doing this with, had unfortunately had a wedding, and he's just kind of not been real active enough to help me get information to make a podcast effectively. So, but regardless, I'm here now, and I did want to change the topic point because I didn't want to start off with such a hard topic, but wanted to start off with something that's a bit more understandable within many religious communities. And I also wanted to apologize for the fact that somehow the background is a little distorted and blurry. I have no idea why, when I had saved it as a JPEG, it got distorted. I've tried multiple methods, it's just becoming blah. So, but with all that out of the way, yes, just wanted to thank you guys for being out here tonight, and we're going to be jumping right into the topic about translation, and why no religion can hold an accurate version of the truth, because that truth has been lost in years of rewrites and different translations. So, with all that out of the way, let's get into the topic. When I say that no religion holds this truth anymore, or that religion has been changed to fit the ideal of the modern society, what exactly do I mean by this? I think there is no better example of this situation than the infamous Leviticus passage, the one that I know as immediately as I say that, every Christian in here, ex-Christian, knows exactly what I'm talking about. The infamous passage of Leviticus that condemns the idea of homosexuality. That mankind shall not lie with another man as though he would womankind, for it is an abomination. Now, this text actually varies depending on which version of the Bible you're reading. In the original King James, it actually says, mankind shall not lie with another man as though he would his partner, for it is an abomination, which doesn't condemn the idea of homosexuality, but does kind of condemn the idea of adultery, which is one of the translations of that passage. But of course, you have some that, kind of blatantly say, thou who that commit homosexual acts are an abomination. Now, there's been a lot of debate with this topic, and most of that debate stems from this idea that homosexuality was never even mentioned in the Bible, because in the modern Bibles, in the modern translation, the word homosexuality is used, but they believe that it had a different meaning back then, and they also believe that it was never even in the original Bible. And most people actually believe that this passage was originally talking about pedophilia and molesting children, than it had anything to do with homosexuality. And this is because of the Bible being rewrote in 1946, when that passage of homosexuality, or I would say more when that translation that talked about homosexuality was added. Now, I talked to someone who had been studying the Bible for 20 years, a very staunch Christian who has now left the faith. He had a Bible from the 1800s, and it was called the Nun Bible. And it was a Bible that pastors and nuns would read and go off of. Hey, something I missed real quick on that. So the book, the Bible, that nuns would base their life off of was not called the Nun's Gospel. It was the Priest's Pulpit of 1800. That was the one that the nuns of the 1800s were basing their life off of, and that was the translation that had that vastly different Leviticus quote. So it was not called the Gospel of Nuns or the Nun's Gospel. It was the Priest's Pulpit of 1800. You can actually find some for sale now, but they're really expensive, like $138. But I just wanted to clarify that for people, that there was no Nun's Gospel or Gospel of Nuns. It was the Priest's Pulpit of 1800 that the nuns would base their lives off of. And the Leviticus passage was vastly different, and this Bible was wrote in the 1800s, so it predates all the Bibles that we have now, the retranslated ones from 1946. And in this passage, the Leviticus passage specifically stated that Thou shalt not lie with a child, for it is an abomination. There was no concept of mankind, womankind, man, woman, just thou shalt not lie with a child, for it is an abomination. Now keep in mind this Bible was wrote in the 1800s, or I wouldn't say wrote, but translated in the 1800s. So it does, again, like I said, predate the Bibles that we have now. So it is a concept, or it is a proof of concept that the religious text is constantly being altered to fit society's standards and ideas. And you might say, well, what about modern society is promoting the concept of child molestation? Realistically, it's still not something that we promote. It's something that we will never promote in society. Knock on wood, we don't go that disgusting. But the reason that I believe, and many others believe, that this translation happened was because of how much the Catholic Church was being accused of child molestation. And getting rid of this passage and pinning it on another minority of people effectively allowed pastors to get away with more deceiving and dirty acts, or to think that they were not going to be held accountable for their awful actions. And to the credit of the Catholic Church, this exactly did work, because you would be disgustingly surprised how many Christians were okay with their children's being touched inappropriately by Catholic pastors, and how many of them would effectively try to defend the pastor for these awful actions. It sounds disgusting, and you might say, I'd never do something if I found out my child was touched inappropriately by a pastor. I would kick that pastor's ass. And good for you, but religion has always been something to use to manipulate people for gain, and we'll talk about that too in this video as well. So unfortunately, it is an example that this passage was likely changed because it takes less credibility or accountability off of the church, and puts it towards a minority that isn't going to be affected, or shouldn't, in their ideas, be affected by the religion. But with all that being said, we kind of have a bit of proof of how this passage has been altered, or how even biblical text is being altered to fit societal ideas and standards. But what if I told you that there was actually another religion, another faith, another civilization that had this a lot worse? One that, even in the modern version of their religion, it is still a problem because of how hard and how bad the translations of this religion have been misinterpreted. Now, most of you don't know what religion I'm talking about. Most of you probably don't know what society I'm talking about. But the society that I'm talking about is ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt is really interesting when talking about what led to its downfall and what led into its kind of problematic situation that it ended up having. And believe it or not, a lot of people actually compare Christianity to the ancient Egyptian religion. A lot of people say that gods like Seth are just like Egyptian Satan, which technically is only half right, because Satan actually means rebel, and Seth did rebel against God. But digressing on all of that, the same problem that ancient Egypt had is also the same problem that modern Christianity is having. And I think that's just kind of ironic almost, that a religion that got compared to it, Christianity being compared to the Egyptian religion, is actually having the same problem, like the history is repeating itself. But digressing, what exactly happened in ancient Egypt that led to this downfall? I'm going to separate Egypt into three categories. I'm going to separate it into the beginning of Egypt, and then I'm going to separate it into the end of Egypt. And there is a middle ground there too. So the beginning of Egypt, the first Egyptians, the old Egyptians, pretty early dynasty really, they had a vastly different belief system than what the New Kingdom and the later Egyptians had. Now, the old Egyptians, they believed that to go to the afterlife, it was all about admitting to the sin. When you would be presented in front of the council of judges, if you could go to them and say, I have sinned, here has been the sin that I commit. Then, if you could admit that sin, your heart would lay lighter than the feather, and you would be granted access to the afterlife. If you couldn't admit to your sin, then your soul was corrupted and truly lost and was devoured by Sobek, who also was possibly a female in some versions of the mythology, which is kind of interesting because some other gods have a lot different origins in the newer versions of it. But either way, your soul is devoured by Sobek, and then I guess you technically fade from existence by that logic. So for the older Egyptians, in the terms of the afterlife, it was all about admitting to the sin and admitting where your wrongdoings were. In the newer Egyptian religion, it was all about material wealth and who had power. Emperors in the rich class and the high class, they would go to the afterlife, but the poor, the peasants, and the middle class, they had to work for the high class and the rich and the emperors, so that the emperors would bless them with their divineness and give them access to the afterlife. Or not access to the afterlife, but give them access so that they may be reincarnated into a rich person, and then they could be, after they die in that life, they can go to the afterlife. So newer Egypt, the later Egypt, not early, but later Egypt started kind of tying material wealth into divine power. And obviously, like you would expect, poor people that are just basically working for a rich class are going to start thinking, wow, this religion is terrible, I'm going to leave it. And of course, that leads to, immigration and people leaving the country. And then whenever war breaks out, the country doesn't have enough people to defend it. And eventually the kingdom falls, which is, lo and behold, exactly what pretty much happened with Egypt. Other than a couple other things like plague and stuff that was going around. But either way, when your country isn't happy and your people people don't care, that your country can't stand. And that's just what happens every time, people try to abuse religion for divine power. So, essentially, that is what ended up happening with ancient Egypt and what eventually led to their downfall. But the reason I bring up the story of ancient Egypt and their religious influence is because it shows that they did rewrite the religion to fit their own agenda. In fact, believe it or not, it's really hard to find information on the early Egyptians, and they believe that it is for the same reason, that it's really hard for us to find early information on like older orthodoxies of Christianity, or really any information on the old Gnostics, because they believe that Christians were destroying their text. Or actually is a belief, they know Christians were destroying their texts. So it's really hard to find accurate information on early Orthodoxes or the Gnostics because Christians destroyed their text, and they believe that's the same reason why it's really difficult for us to find information on the earlier dynasties of Egypt, because they believe the New Kingdom was likely destroying text so that they can push their idea and new agenda on the people instead of letting them follow an older idea. And it's really corrupt, it's really terrible, but we have that proof that kind of states that had all happened. And some of this, even the religious belief right now, like if you're like, oh, I want to know about the Egyptian mythology, I want to know about what they believed in. If you go and buy a Book of the Dead, like an Egyptian Book of the Dead, you're likely not going to get you're going to get a version of the Book of the Dead that'll likely tell you something vastly different than what was actually originally wrote. And it's kind of like the Bible. You go and buy any Bible, the King James or the Mormons' Bible, and they're all going to say vastly different things about the mythology or the stories, because they're all going to have different origins and different interpretations that kind of get influenced. So, like I said, this here is proof that religion has been altered by society, their own faith, to try to hold a more political power over the people. So we have seen that, there's two aspects of how religion has been rewrote by their own faith. We have the Leviticus example where, again, the passage was intentionally mistranslated to put blame at homosexuals rather than put blame at pedophiles because of accusations going on with the Catholic Church. And we also have seen with ancient Egypt that they rewrote the religion so that it would give them, the rich and the more wealthy people, more power over the weak and the poor people. So, do we have any other examples? Are these the only two examples that we have of religion being intentionally influenced for some kind of political gain or power? Yes. We actually do have another example. There was a religious group that was going around intentionally smearing other religions um, during the Bronze Age, just so that their religion would be seen more as the dominant religion rather than being seen as just another religion that stemmed from another one, like a lot of religions seem to do. And when I say this topic, there was a religious faith that was intentionally, say, smear mongering another religion, a lot of you guys might actually know who I'm talking about. Some of you might not. So, for those who don't, I am talking about the Canaanites. The Canaanites are very interesting because for the longest time we didn't have a lot of information about them. We had plenty of accounts of them in Old Testament, and we had accounts of them in some of the Egyptian stories, but we didn't have a lot of concrete information on them that wasn't kind of perceived as bias. And that actually goes into the Canaanite pantheon, which was like Baal, El, and I think Chemosh also came from the Canaanite pantheon. And we didn't have a lot of information but what the Judists had said about them. And the Judists said that these people were sacrificing their children to Baal and depicting Baal as this sacrificial god, which he wasn't. And the actual story of Baal, the Canaanite god, he was a god that basically just ruled over the other gods, watched over them from his castle. Just basically was, trying to keep the order in the world. And it was also said that Baal would travel to the underworld to fight their god of the dead. And every year that he won, in the spring and the fall, it would bring upon great rain. So Baal was not an evil god, at least not to the Canaanites. And there was only biblical accounts that stated that they were committing child sacrifice when it's supposedly believed that they weren't. It's kind of hard to tell because the issue is that the Old Testament keeps throwing the words child sacrificer and adultery people at anything they simply didn't like, anything that promoted polytheism. We know this with pagans. We know this with Jews. Christians threw that term at Jews. So a lot of the Judists were throwing that term at essentially just anyone that was, polytheistic. So it's really hard to tell if they were truly sacrificing children or not. But with the way that they speak of themselves in their own text, it doesn't sound like they would have even considered such a thing. But digressing a little bit on that and talking about how the Judists were rewriting another religion, the Judists were, like I said before, depicting Baal out to be this god that wanted to basically rule the world in chaos, when the actual even name for Baal, which means god of the gods, he was essentially just wanting to keep the order in the world and would try to bring his people prosper every fall whenever he would go to the underworld and kill, or I guess combat the god of the dead, or the god of the underworld, so that they're, I wanted to say again. I'm like, well, you probably don't know. So that, killing the god of the dead so that the rain would prosper in the fall. So we don't actually have proof that what the Judists were writing was actually true about the Canaanites, but it is proof that there was a religious orthodox that was trying to intentionally rewrite another faith, another religion, so that religion was seen as bad and their religion would be seen as the dominant one. In fact, not even just with the Canaanites, but we also know this because they did the same thing with the Israelites. So any religion that wasn't Judist was effectively just a child-sacrificing, adultery person, which I still don't understand the Judist mindset behind that, because Judges literally sacrificed his child in the name of Yahweh, so I don't really understand how they think their religion was better when it committed the same acts as they accused others of. But digressing on that, because I'm not here to debate Christian semantics. So this isn't Judist, but another example of kind of intentional rewriting in religion, or another religion trying to sabotage another religion. This is Christian. This is a Christian situation, so this happened after Judas. But around the time period of when the first Catholic Church was being built in Britain, they had discovered the Nag Hammadi. Hey guys, it's me. Just to clarify something, the Nag Hammadi was not founded at the beginning of the Catholic Church. It was founded in 1945. I got confused because there were a lot of other lost books that were coming into picture before the Nag Hammadi, so I just kind of stumbled on my brain a little. Gnostic text. And this Gnostic text, to kind of sum up who the Gnostics were, they were essentially people who, they did believe in Jesus, but they believed that Jesus was the creator god, or was the masculine side of the creator god, Sophia, and he was coming here to preach against Yaldabaoth, who was what they believed to be the Christian god, or the Old Testament god, Yaldabaoth, his name can kind of vary. So that's what they believed, and that didn't really resign well with the Catholic Church. So a lot of the Gnostic text, even informations on, again, possibly older Orthodox Christians that we don't know of, we almost have no information on, because the Catholic Church went and intentionally was destroying any information that we had on them, or on the older Orthodox Christians. So it's not, I wouldn't even say, the only reason I would kind of say religion sabotaging another religion is because technically Christians don't claim Gnostics as Christians, they claim them as heretics. So it's kind of like hard to say if you would want to consider this a religion sabotaging their own religion, but that could also kind of depend on just what your idea of what a Christian is. But the Gnostics, a lot of the Gnostic text was destroyed, and only very few books survived, the Catholic Church basically trying to write them out of existence. And I more laugh because it is believed that the Judists were trying to destroy all the text obtaining to the Canaanites, and trying to basically write them out of history. And I kind of find it ironic that history repeated itself, and Christians soon found themselves doing the same thing with their own faith. And if what they say is true, that the Canaanites stemmed, or that Judaism stemmed from the Canaanites, it's kind of like they were, destroying their original source. And if the Gnostics did come before, well, they did come before the Catholic Church, and there is some belief that it actually came before Christianity, and actually was around the time period of the Judists. We kind of know this because the Lost Book of Enoch is considered Gnostic. But, Gnostics came before the Catholic Church that was being formed in Britain, and then they were destroying the religious text of what basically created them. So it's just kind of like a really vicious, endless cycle with a lot of religions just trying to sabotage other religions because they need their religion to be seen as a more predominant religion than another faith. So we now have two big examples of religion kind of being intentionally rewrote. I wouldn't say this is unintentional. If it was unintentional, they wouldn't touch it. We've got two big examples of religion being intentionally rewrote to either fit the ideals of the people who were in power, or to let one religion be seen as the more predominant religion. And there is one other example of religion kind of trying to do this, and this kind of goes into the Celtic situation, because we don't have a lot of information on the Celtic. But I'm not going to go like really in depth like I did in the other ones, but one of the main gods in the Celtic religion, which was called the Morgan, her name apparently isn't actually the Morgan. They believe that Christians made that name to de-deify her, to make her more out as a nightmare and a embodiment of sin rather than an actual god. But we'll talk about the topic of de-deifying in another video. Anyways, so what example? My gosh, I'm stepping on my own tongue now. So we have all these examples of religion being intentionally rewrote to fit aspects of a person's belief. Does this help us prove that no religion holds the truth? And the answer is yes. No religion holds a definitive truth, because, like I said, it is always changing. It's kind of like the same logic with science. Science is only theories. It's not actually, it's not fully proven because something can always disprove science. In fact, they always say science is constantly looking to prove itself wrong so that it can try to make another proof that it was right. Or not proof that it was right, but trying to prove itself wrong because science wants to get results. And it's kind of like with the current situation where they believe the Big Bang actually isn't what created the universe. There's a lot of information with science. Again, it's constantly trying to prove itself wrong. The only thing difference between science and religion is that religion is always being abused. It's always trying to be influenced by society. It's always trying to be something that it was never originally. Like, again, we see this with the ancient Egyptian religion, and we see this with the Leviticus quote. We see that people intentionally influence religion. People don't normally intentionally influence science, debatably, don't intentionally influence science to try to abuse society. I think that if science, started becoming a position of power, it likely would be starting to get abused, but it's really hard to abuse science when it is always something concrete that can be backed up with evidence and proof. So if someone tries to abuse science, well, then someone can actually show the science that would disprove that claim. So it's harder to abuse science than it is religion. But digressing on that topic, the issue is that we cannot definitively say that anything we read from a religious book is the accurate interpretation and truth of what that religion stood for. And while I personally am against Christianity, I can't tell you that what we have in the book now is actually what Jesus was preaching. I can't tell you that what we have in these books now, is the definitive answer to what the Judists were doing. Because again, it's constantly a translated and rewrote thing to where it's just we don't have the definitive answer to anything. So no religion can hold the truth, or to restate the question, no religion can hold the truth because religion has been proven to be been intentionally rewrote to fit society's standards. So that means the religion that you believe in is likely not what was actually written there. Now, what I always say to the people who ask me religious questions is I always encourage people to just work with the gods themselves, and whatever god that you choose to resign with. Ask them questions, because you're going to get more definitive answers from them, debatably, some gods. You're going to get more accurate answers from them than you're going to get from anything that was influenced by man. So regardless of what your faith is, all that really matters is what you believe in. You should never try to force this upon anyone else, because you can't really argue your faith, because it's always going to step on someone else's faith. So it should always just be something that you keep to yourself instead of trying to convince everyone else that they need to believe, which is, I know, really hard for modern Christians to be able to do. But with all that being said, that is all for the podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope my voice didn't annoy you. Please feel free to leave any criticism in the comments so that I can better improve the quality of my podcasts. And I will see you on the flip side. Also, if you want, I have my Patreon linked in the description. And I'm going to link a little bit of sources for you guys to kind of do your own investigation on some of these things with like the Canaanites and Baal, so that you guys can maybe better understand the religions yourself. But with all that being said, have a good night, everyone, and I hope I'll see you in the next one.